Guys, do you know this is a Patreon episode?
No, I did not know that.
Oh, well.
This is going to be our second most valuable Patreon episode, I think. After the, what did we do? Phenomenology, Spirit?
Yeah. All right. Hey, big spenders. My nips are rock hard.
No, this is going to be extremely relevant no matter what you study, read, think. Cut that. Okay. Today, history's most famous incel. In fact, he's more successful than all other incels combined, and the best thing to happen to 20-year-olds, at least until Fight Club.
Do you want us to clap?
I am, of course, talking about the esteemed source of the quotes, God is dead. When you stare into the abyss stares back, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Ecce homo, Fried Nietzsche.
Friedrich Nietzsche.
Fried Nietzsche. You may have seen him in such television shows as The Sopranos and such movies as, what was that movie I said?
Little Miss Sunshine.
Little Miss Sunshine, which is one of my favorites. And yeah, so we have not planned this at all.
Yeah.
But it's going to be epic because I think all of us know. Because
Nietzsche's so obvious. It's so obvious to interpret him that we didn't need to prepare.
Yeah. I also feel it's appropriate to a style.
That was a joke,
right?
by the way. That was a joke.
You don't plan things systematically. You just whip out aphorisms one after another, throw in a little bit of woman hatred, and you're good.
Yeah, throw in some something about how you miss the caste system.
Oh yeah, of course. Can't forget that.
Yes, something about waterfalls.
And I guess he wasn't technically an incel if he died of syphilis. I think it's a conspiracy that he died of syphilis, and God just destroyed his mind because he didn't want Christians to hear what he had to say.
Well, tragically,
what do you think about Nietzsche being 20-year-old's favorite philosopher, though?
I think that's accurate.
Yeah,
I think he's.
Yeah, it's like the last 10 years of his life.
I think a lot of people just read him when they're 20, and then they get really excited, and then they'll either move on and end up following a more pragmatic career, or they just move on to like other philosophers, or they become Richard Spencer and just stay at Nietzsche.
Yeah. He did go back to live with his mother for the last 10 years of his life, but then she died.
No, I think I can understand why, though. I mean, like, if you think about pretty much any of the other major philosophers, except for Plato and a handful of others, reading them isn't exactly a lot of fun, right? I mean, nobody's going to go through the Critique of Pure Reason and think like, God, I feel deeply inspired by this. It's mostly going to be like, what the fuck is this saying? Whereas you read Nietzsche and he almost creates a compact with you saying, my readers have not yet come and they're going to be fantastic people and it's accessible and violent and filled with like stuff that seems superficially easy to understand. Like, I totally get it, right?
Of
and
course.
it covers like a lot of the existential issues 20-year-olds deal with, right?
Exactly.
You can you can tell he's been propped up.
You guys don't know this about me, but I was an adamant Kantian before I read Nietzsche, and
Were
then
you
I
really?
I had a crisis as a 20-year-old.
You were a fucking Kantian at first?
Oh yeah, I was just eating that shit up. Like Critique of Practical Reason, I viewed this thing as the Bible as a 20-year-old. So you can't really trust 20-year-olds because they believe everything they read.
Yeah, of course.
But
Not the worst Bible.
I think it was Twilight of the Idols or the Gay Science that I read, which I have right here actually. But I read that and it just shattered my world. I was like, morality's not real. You can't trust. I had an AJ Soprano moment.
Yeah.
So that was like your gateway drug to post-structuralism, because then you became like a Derridian, a language philosopher guy after that.
Yeah, I've had my Nietzsche phase, my Heidegger phase, my Derrida phase.
We should also be I feel like we should be a little bit more precise too when we talk about 20-year-olds. We're really talking about 20-year-old men specifically. I think it's worth being specific.
Yeah.
What did you say in Thus Spoke Zarathustra or Thus Spake Zarathustra, depending on how you translate it? There's that one woman who says to Zarathustra, like, goest thou to woman, make sure you bring a whip. And I found out later on that he wrote the book after his lover of sorts, not even really because she had ditched him, had just dumped him to go off on a vacation with their mutual buddy. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is where like the incident comes out strong.
That wasn't Wagner's wife, was it?
Well, that was a tragic. That's like another tragic thing that so many 20-year-old men go through, right? Being in the friend zone with some chick that he's hanging out with all the time, but doesn't actually want to be with him. What was her name?
Dumped. getting friend zoned.
Was it Lou Salome, or is that
Yeah,
just
that's
in
it.
my head?
That's
Yeah,
it.
Lou
No,
Salome.
Louis Salome.
Okay.
Well, I read like some article about her where she was describing Nietzsche like years later, because she went and became a very successful person herself, right? Particularly influenced by psychoanalysis. But somebody used to ask her, like, so what was it like spending time with Nietzsche? And the sense that you got from her is she was like, smart guy, but like I was 20 years old and I wanted to go out and have a party and basically engage in like kinky activities across of Europe. And this guy was like, no, we need to stay up, not drink, not do all that. The important thing is to talk about philosophy all the time.
Yeah, he was an ascetic, I think. No alcohol, no drugs.
Yeah.
Oh, that's like the opposite of Nietzsche.
And then Lou Salome, when she was way older, became a groomer and started philandering with Rilke, the poet.
Really?
Heidegger said he was like the best poet. I don't. This is all coming from my memory, so I haven't checked. It might be full of shit, but no, she moved around the intellectual crowds in Germany for sure.
Yeah.
Did she do writing as well, Matt? I'm not sure.
I
Who's that
believe
famous-
so, but I'm not sure.
Here's in the chat. Here's that famous photo of Lou Salome and Nietzsche, and she's holding a whip for some reason.
There you go.
She wanted to get kink, and he was.
Yeah, exactly. This is it, and he's looking a little bit
He
apprehensive.
was in the mountain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, he got spurned by her, and then that's why we call him an incel in jest.
Exactly.
Although dying from syphilis, he probably contracted it during the Franco-Prussian War, I think is the theory that I heard. Either died of syphilis or God destroyed his brain. The jury's out.
I think pretty much for the whole 1890s he was out, because his last books came out in like the 1880s,
Yeah.
and then he went back to live with his mother, and then his mother died, and his sister Elizabeth took over caring for him, and she was like a big anti-Semitic, like Wagner. So she like basically made his work into what would be taken up by the Nazi Party and National Socialism.
There's actually a
basically-
video of Nietzsche in his brain dead state. You see
Really?
that?
Oh, it's creepy as fuck.
Probably the first
It's-
philosopher on video.
It's just him, like 10 pounds of mustache, and he's just like looking off into the void. The void's probably looking back at
Oh,
him, but
definitely,
we don't know. And he's just, oh my god, he's brain dead. He looks like someone you just have to like spoon yogurt into his open mouth for the rest of his life.
Have you guys heard this other bit of hearsay? And then we'll get to it. But all this hearsay is fun. I don't know if this is true or not. It sounds like American propaganda, but I heard from somewhere, sometime along the line, that whereas American soldiers carried the Bible, or they were all given a Bible as part of their like service kit, meanwhile the German soldiers were given a copy of Thus Spake Zarathustra.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Really?
I mean, this sounds like it's like the forces of good against the.
I feel like we
dark
could easily. I
armies
feel like
of,
we
like-
could easily verify that by doing a quick Google search.
Yeah, that's a little too nice.
I almost don't want to know the answer though. I just want to like believe in this American propaganda.
Yeah.
Like we're the moral ones, and they read Nietzsche.
That's a little too nice. Yeah, we gave our soldiers morphine, and they gave their soldiers Nietzsche.
Well, if it doesn't
Which
kill
one
you, it
was
makes,
worse?
doesn't kill you, makes you stronger,
Yeah.
right?
And if you get addicted, fuck you.
Deal with it, boy.
But the fact, like, just the thought that every like Wehrmacht German soldier is like thinking of themselves as this triumphing overman conquering the world
The Ubermensch.
in the name of Nazism, which Nietzsche is associated with because of his bitch sister. But
yeah.
That's an important concept. We'll definitely have to Uber mention that one.
All right.
I'm becoming a dad. Not really, but I'm practicing.
all right, where do we want to start?
That's a good question.
Like, we should separate. There's two interpretations here at least, because we're making fun of him for being the 20-year-old's favorite philosopher, which is legit because he's so accessible. But
Nietzsche is multiple.
But Heidegger's longest book is on Nietzsche. Deleuze writes on Nietzsche.
Foucault's entire method is modeled after Nietzsche's. Derrida's into Nietzsche, especially that earlier work on the truth and morality, or on truth and lying in a non-moral sense, was a major. That's the one where he delivered his truth is a mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. That was a big one.
Yeah, historiography, religious studies, theology. It's
Environmentalism. There's an environmentalist Nietzsche. There's a queer
Well,
feminist
maybe
Nietzsche.
we should start.
There's a far right Nietzsche.
Here, I'll start with
Maybe
this.
we should
I'll
start with-
I'll start reading the beginning of Deleuze's book on Nietzsche.
Okay.
The concept of genealogy. Nietzsche's most general project is the introduction of the concepts of sense and value into philosophy. It is clear that modern philosophy has largely lived off Nietzsche, but not perhaps in the way in which he would have wished. Nietzsche made no secret of the fact that philosophy of sense and values had to be a critique. One of the principal motifs of Nietzsche's work is that Kant had not carried out a true critique because he was not able to pose the problem of critique in terms of values. And what has happened in modern philosophy is that the theory of values has given rise to new conformism and new forms of submission.
So for what's he saying there? Something like for Kant, critique is oriented towards what we can know about the world and truth, and morality is just one of those sorts of transcendental truths. As in, if we're operating...
Well, when he says values, I don't think he's talking about moral values specifically.
Well,
I
it's
think
Christian moral values and the slave morality and ethics. Like, that's all sort of tied up in values, like what we hold dear, right? And truth becomes a value in a sense.
I think I have a different interpretation. I'm not sure if he means values in terms of morality precisely alone. Like, that's the subject of the transvaluation of values or whatever. But for him, the notion of values is more generally historical, or historicist, I should say, in interpreting history, and that values or like everything's a value. There are no facts, really, because everything has to be placed in its historical hermeneutic, I think. So everything's interpreted is Nietzsche's line, whereas Kant's value system is saying there's things that are not interpreted. Like
but there are also no truths separate from human perception. That's another thing.
Yeah.
He's a big aesthetics guy. Aesthetics in the old sense.
He's a radical historicist.
Well, the way I see it, actually, because he sometimes characterized himself as an anti-Platonist, right, and denigrated Christianity as Platonism for the masses, right? But if you one way to interpret Plato, and I think this is the way Nietzsche does that, is Plato has this very interesting theory, which is that all good things, and I'm meaning good colloquially, go together, right? Truth is related to justice, which is related to beauty, which is related to eternity, which is related to God, and all these things can kind of be synthesized together, right? And the course of Western philosophy has essentially been to show that these things not only don't go together, but they all might be empty or self-justifying, right? And so the modernist revolution from Hume onward basically says, well, actually, there's this stark distinction between facts and values, and you might be able to know facts, but value judgments are independent of that, and they're primarily based on subjective orientations, affect, and so on and so forth. And Nietzsche's total critique seems to be saying that actually even the notion of truth, now that we've abandoned our Platonism, needs to come under scrutiny. And he actually refers to this kind of Platonic language of values as being together, I think, to kind of highlight how far we've come from this original idea that all good things are a kind of unity.
Yeah, truth, morality, aesthetics, goodness, all of this is a conceit that comes out of history and a particular history. That's the thesis of the genealogy of morals. So just to give our listeners a mental template here, Nietzsche has a long shit list. Judeo-Christianity, if you want to lump those two together, are on the shit list. Liberalism is on the shit list. Any philosophy that is after Plato is on the shit list.
Democracy
is on the shit list.
Socialism. Science.
And so what's the problem with all this stuff? Yeah, socialism's on the shit list.
Yeah, communism, science.
Everybody except for
truth.
Like Homeric heroes, like Achilles.
He liked Voltaire.
No, he likes the samurai. He likes the Vikings. He likes the Romans.
Napoleon.
He likes Napoleon. He likes Homer, and he likes the old Greek tragedies. He liked Wagner, but then he started hating Wagner. But he fell in love with Wagner's wife.
So I think it seems like a lot of these critiques come from this place that Nietzsche always wants to invoke this category of like life affirming, like some sort of instincts for life, some sort of vitality. I don't know. Like, well, how would you guys, like, it's a bit ambiguous, but that's often what he invokes. He says that these other things, like morality, they're like suppressing like the true instinct for life, or this vitality, or this kind of like, I guess, ability for the human to achieve a kind of self-mastery or an overcoming. That's where the idea of the overman, I think, comes from.
It is. It's a little bit like Stoicism and nihilism put together. Like it's acknowledging that suffering is inevitable, and we shouldn't base our worldview on trying to avoid suffering. And on the other hand, that it's a celebration, a sensual celebration of the sort of living life to its fullest.
Yeah, I'll talk about like
he's the wild man in that sense.
True human instincts. That's why I think 20-year-olds, like, this is actually, I think, the part where like the 20-year-olds get attracted to him, right? Because I think everything we set up to this point, it's like maybe not necessarily clear, like, well, why would 20-year-olds like it? But it's because of this claim, right? That all these things that you're being told are bullshit, and they're like hiding and suppressing our true potential to be these like self-overcoming, like fucking awesome, like, I don't know, like alpha males, like alpha male dons. Exactly.
Like 300, every Zack Snyder movie is like acting out this impulse to be Nietzschean.
Oh,
exactly.
Yeah.
Zack Snyder's a secret 20-year-old. Like the movie 300 or all this stupid Batman, they're like, no, this is a movie. It's so gritty. It's dark. It's for like real men.
Or even Batman versus Superman, right? I mean, the whole thing that they go through in that in this really cheesy way is like, what does it mean for a Superman to be on Earth, right? Somebody who's just better at everything than everybody.
Nietzsche was kind of like an atheist too. Like he gave this voice to atheism, and that's what I felt. Like a lot of people feel that's like right. when they pick up someone like Christopher Hitchens and they get this sort of secularist worldview that is against religion. Like that was one of the things that attracted me. Like Nietzsche could articulate a worldview that was completely separate. Like not even when you read German idealism, you get the sense that it's just Christianity disguised as philosophy. But when you read Nietzsche, you get the sense that he's really trying to articulate something that's completely separate from Christian values and has nothing to do with it, and is in many ways against it.
And I think one of the distinct things about it is also how he doesn't just historicize a lot of value systems, whatever those happen to be, but he also psychologizes them. And I think this speaks to Eric's point, right? Where the only time when he seems to make value judgments, if you even want to call it that, are aesthetic judgments about health and sickness. And it's always related back to biological metaphors, right? So he tends to evaluate moral philosophies, not in the way that we would do it, but by saying that this philosophy is sick, right? It's a kind of pathology that would be adopted by unhealthy or weak people, right?
Exactly.
Who are unable to deal with their resentment through aggression, so they do it by adopting a slave mentality, right? But it still kind of creeps at him.
Incidentally, he was a very sick man himself, too. Like, debilitatingly
so. He was ill. He had to quit university, his post, and he went on disability. He got a disability pension after he left his university post.
Back to Eric's point about this secularism or atheism.
Or self-proclaimed antichrist.
The way that we have this, like, Sam Harris, that crew, they say, oh, we just don't need God, and then, like, everything's fine. We can just, like, be moral, rational, intelligent, etc. And like atheism's just fine. But Nietzsche is very good at understanding psychologically, no, atheism is traumatic. Atheism means you can only create values. History's not going anywhere. It's this eternal recurrence. Everything is only what you make it, and 100% of the responsibility for that is on you. So it's not a happy atheism. It's not like, oh, we got rid of God, the tyrant is dead. It's like, now you're fucking alone on this rock, you little monkey.
But there is a joy.
Nietzsche's
but there is
not
a joy
logic
to
bro
it.
either, is he? Nietzsche's not a logic bro. He's not saying we don't need theism. We just need reason. He's not saying that either, because that's what that's what like the Hitchens, Dawkins, Sam Harris types are, like reason, logic, right? Nietzsche's not for that. Reason for Nietzsche comes from the same place that Christianity comes from. It has that ascetic, self-denying core.
But it's a self-denying.
For reason, it's simply objective reason. I got to keep my feelings out of it. And for Christianity, it's more obvious why that's ascetic.
I think you're exactly right, Eric. And I think if he were alive today and he saw the logic bros or the radical skeptics or YouTube atheists, right? He'd probably find them just as annoying as he found people like John Stuart Mill, right? Because in his mind, what they want to do is keep the trappings of Christian culture, its emphasis on reason, its emphasis on logic, its emphasis on the moral value of everybody, or at least the moral value truth. Of advancing human welfare. And they want to just chuck the theology and secularize it. And Nietzsche would say, you can't do that, If you say that there's no God and there's no value to human life, why the fuck do you think that it's important to actually advance human welfare, right? On what basis do you make that kind of claim?
Victor, you've been trying to talk.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so is it the case that there's a kind of, there is a kind of self-denial, but I also see it there being actually quite a joyful and hopeful aspect to Nietzsche, which is that we don't have to deny anymore. We can just be, we can let loose and uncover these true instincts for life. And that only a true culture with the right kind of values can reveal. So in some ways, there's he's kind of I often read him as kind of sneaking in values through almost an empirical human nature claim about that the human beings are an organism, that there is a state of the human animal that is the exhibitive state of the best version of a human being. And all these things that we use to try to suppress and lie to ourselves and have this morality that's supposed to be reasonable. It's just a way of hiding what we are, which is an instantiation of this will to power or something, this process, this mindless, godless process. But when we try to deny it and lie to us, we get sick, right? We get sick. A culture that makes us deny this, we become a sick culture. And the goal is supposed to be to uncover and let loose this energy, this vitality that is our true instincts for life as an animal. So there's kind of so the values come from this empirical claim almost of what the universe is, and that the animal has its best version where its instincts are being unleashed, if that makes sense.
I just want to add to this by saying that I'm now picturing George Bataille or Michel Foucault in the middle of some hardcore BDSM and just ramming every kind of thing into every conceivable orifice, covered in bodily fluids, and their fucking person is is it right? And they're doesn't fucking matter. God is dead, okay? There's no right or wrong. Just give in to your animal impulse.
But there's a joyfulness to it, right? That's why the gay science, right? The joyful science. I mean, there is there's a joyfulness to unleashing. We can let go of this now and we can just be ourselves.
Yeah,
Thank
we can
God.
have all the kinky BDSM we want, right?
There's a relief. There's a relief.
Well, now that picture's in all of our heads. So thanks for that. Matt.
He wants us to get there. He wants us to understand that morality and values are historical, and that truth is, well, on the one hand, it's a lie, but it's a useful lie.
Yeah,
truth is
and
a
if
value.
we can understand that, then we can be gay about it. We can have a gay science. We can be cheerful. We can be happy-go-lucky.
Super gay.
And this is in a way the noble values, right? As opposed to the slave values. The nobles are happy-go-lucky. They live in the moment. They don't sacrifice the now to the future. They don't sacrifice the future to the now.
And I think
they just go for it.
Ecce homo.
Yeah, I think that actually points to another really interesting feature of Nietzsche's work that you don't actually see in many philosophers, although you do see it all the time in a lot of the authors that Nietzsche was influenced, people like Dostoevsky, and is also present in Heidegger, which is that Nietzsche is a moody motherfucker, right? Some days he writes up and he's talking about the joyful science or the gay science and how it is that now that we're liberated from God, we can allow our instincts to take over without needing to fall into resentment and pathological dissociation like we did before. But other days he wakes up and it's exactly the way Victor describes. He feels nihilistic and he feels upset and he says, there's no meaning to anything. And this is captured in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I think, very nicely, because Zarathustra basically goes on all these weird odysseys. And Nietzsche must have been one of the very first philosophers in the Western tradition that I can think of, at least, who really takes the idea of mood seriously. You know what I mean? He says, every other philosopher likes to characterize us this way or that way, when really, we have multitudes within us, as Walt Whitman would say. Right? Some days I want to go destroy things. Other days I want to be a pleasant person and get along with others. Other days I just feel like shit and I want to say, get the fuck away and I want the world to leave me alone. Right?
There's a good case to be made that he was severely manic depressive, because you can see his mania and his depression both in his work. And then there's like the book Ecce Homo, and all the chapter titles are like, why I am so wise, why I write such good books, why by
his first interpreters took him more as like a stance, an attitude, or a disposition rather than a philosopher too. His first, like the modernists, because obviously Nietzsche died in 1900, and that's sort of, you're into modernism now. They read him as an attitude. They didn't look at him as a philosopher. And he was one of those philosophers who, he wrote poetically, right? There's an aesthetic pleasure to just reading his books. It's not like humor. Kant, where it's very dry and very logical, and everything is sort of constructed in this nice, neat way. No, his way, he's poetic. He's outrageous.
He's funny.
He's like,
he is funny.
One second he's like tickling your balls. The next second he's kicking you in the teeth. It's kind of a ride just reading him. Yep. And he really like reproduces what he wants to get in that aesthetic experience of just reading this sort of beautiful, weird philosophy and this aphoristic style that was not taken seriously at the time.
But I think that's refreshing.
It's interesting stuff.
Just to give an example, because we're talking about his aphorisms, this is at random, I opened it up, but it's a nice punctuation. What matters is whether I am acknowledged to be right. I am much too right. And he who laughs best today will also laugh last.
That's funny.
There you go. Laughter is a big thing in every book. There's something about laughter in it. And it's some kind of abstract laughter, like the fates laughing at us.
I think it's like an absurdist sort of laughter. It's not like...
It's like the laughter in rap videos when they start and they're like, it's nothing funny happened. It's just like, I'm so confident and rich that I just laugh.
I think you laugh in the face of fate would be a big thing for him. He's very fatalistic.
But he embraces it. He tries to get us to embrace the slings and arrows, right? He doesn't want us to sort of get into this Christian mode of thinking where, like, if I just endure this, everything will be better. The judgment, I'll have eternity and all the wealth and riches in heaven. Like, he thinks that that's a cop-out and you're not living your life if you're thinking of the world as fallen and disastrous and the shadow of the valley of death type approach to living.
That's kind of refreshing, though. And again, I think testifies to his appeal to particularly young people, right? Because when you read a lot of these philosophers, they don't write like people in the sense of being a complete human, altered human being, right? Kant kind of sits there and he's like, these are my thoughts about the subject matter. Here's counter-argument A, B, C. Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas are like, here's proposition 1, scholium, blah, 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 blah. And if you read Nietzsche, you do get kind of a sense, like if you read Kierkegaard, or for that matter, if you read Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or whoever it happens to be, that you kind of get a sense for his personality, right? Like you can almost imagine what it'd be like if he were at a bar and he were to walk in and sit down and be like, I'm not ordering any drinks and you shouldn't either. And be like, fuck off, bro. And then you'd have like a long conversation with him and you'd never know which Nietzsche you were going to get because maybe he'd storm in and be like, I had a fantastic day today. I've climbed mountains that none of before, or maybe he'd be really depressed. And I think that's refreshing, right? Like you kind of get a sense for who he was as a person.
I think he would be a nightmare to actually be friends with, though.
Probably. He's angsty as fuck, probably.
And arrogant. Megalomaniac as fuck.
No, arrogant as fuck, yeah.
He had talent for making friends into enemies, right? Like, there's no doubt about that.
I think he wrote, I think maybe he kind of wrote in a way, I was just thinking about this when you were talking, Matt, the style of writing is almost maybe analogous to the way he thinks you should live life, that what a true life is, whereas the Kantian way of writing, it's so I was going to make a comment before about how I think another thing at play in his sort of ontology is this relationship he has to distance, to the way things keep you away from your true instincts for life. And one of those is the way science, it tries to formalize things and to divide things up. And he's now you're distanced from the thing. You're not united. There's this whole thing where there's supposed to be a relationship. There's when you're in the world, you have this horizon of meaning that's only possible when you're engaged in the world and in touch with your instincts. And I wonder if to some extent the style of writing speaks to the way he thinks your life should be experienced as this this vitality, this ride of eruptions of emotion and feeling. And it's these other formalistic ways, they're just keeping you from that truth of what human life should be.
No, I think if you look at the kind of authors that he admired, right? Dostoevsky, Voltaire,
Shakespeare.
yeah, Shakespeare, right? I mean, all of them have that kind of vitality to their writing, and express a kind of panoramic vision of the human personality that's less judgmental, shall we say, of people's idiosyncrasies or their failures to live up to their own standards. More willing to acknowledge their hypocrisies and so on. And maybe in some senses we could say that a lot of his philosophy or the way that he wrote is an attempt to react against this, because there was nobody who's better at put downs than Nietzsche, right? I remember he was talking about Hegel. I think it was in one of his pieces on Wagner, where he was talking about the birth of tragedy. And he said, my earlier books to me read as offensively Hegelian. And when I say offensively Hegelian, I mean the rot of it just like comes up into my nose, and the stench of it like makes me feel sick to my stomach. And you're just like, man, he clearly wrote that just like sitting down. He's like, this is a perfect chance just to get like a fucking sick dig at Hegel. Because, Hegel embodies exactly this also rationalistic method.
And he means the dialectic, too. His thinking was too dialectical, which if you go back to one of our earlier episodes, you can learn all about that.
Yeah, but I mean, if you look at the figures that he admired, right, that's the point. He doesn't like people who sit there and try to rationalize or dissociate themselves from their own vital impulses, right, even when they push people in different direction, right? And I think there's a kind of virtue for that also, right, because you do get a more complete vision of the uglier sides of human beings as well as the more noble sides in his work.
That's the core of asceticism, is self-denial. You deny yourself these pleasures. You deny, like, what does it mean to be ascetic? It kind of means, like, this is his bad kind of morality, is the ascetic kind of morality.
But he was an ascetic.
And he thinks that
he was an ascetic. I think it matters why you are doing that action, not what you're doing, right?
But like the noble and the ascetic are a kind of opposite in his work. Like the noble you just kind of do what you want. He talks about nobility as like good and bad, and good is, like going out and conquering somebody and bringing back a whole load of treasure and booty and slaves and whatever, and bad is just derivative of that. You fail to do that. Whereas the other kind of morality, that ascetic morality, where the good is being weak.
But yeah, he was an ascetic in his life, as like not drinking and all this stuff, and not taking medicine for his headaches. But what he hates is that the ascetic moralizes to everybody else and says, you have to give up everything good too. Like Christianity is the worst offender. You have to give up sex. Well, yeah. You have to be married. You have to follow all these institutions, but you have to do it to yourself and then enjoy it. And to him, this is just like really disgusting that you're compelled to follow these rules that make your life worse and then be celebrated for that. You're celebrating mediocrity because you're a wimp.
Also, I think that his form of asceticism, right? So those things that he's denying himself, alcohol, medicine, it makes sense because those are things that are interfering with the inner vitality that he has as a human being. So like, to me, it makes sense that he'd be like, don't do those things. Just like the way Christianity masks the truth of like the human, the vital human. It's like, also I could imagine him saying alcohol and medicine does the same thing.
I think actually he has a really Freudian insight. Just rip off pills for a second. He often claims that when people pathologically try to dissociate from their seemingly baser instincts, they're not actually going to disappear. They're just going to take on a new and more idolatrous form, right? And I think one of the most pregnant passages in his entire work was when he's analyzing Tertullian, who's Christian state. And Tertullian describes how it is that after a life of sitting there, living in a world of sin where bad people seem to get ahead, denying yourself all your pleasures, one of the great joys that's going to exist in heaven is all the righteous are going to live with God, and they're going to be able to stare down into hell and enjoy the suffering of the people in the hell, which is probably going to include a lot of the people who mocked the Christians in real life, right? And know that justice has been done. And Nietzsche points to this and says, well, there you go. This is what your love and compassion and dissociating from your baser instincts does to you. They're not gone. You've now just projected them into a cosmology and said that God is now going to punish people for you. And you're going to sit there and be able to take satisfaction from knowing that their suffering is going to be eternal. And It's a pretty interesting insight, right?
Yeah, that's it. It's based in he says things like, well, it's translated as rancor or vitriol, like the slave ethic is based on hating, basically. Like they're haters. That's what he basically thinks the entire Judeo-Christian tradition is
So
a
like
philosophy of haters.
Taylor Swift was the best Nietzschean in the world then, with her whole like haters gonna hate, you know?
Because like you're like, let's pretend we are the aristocracy and we are subduing these people, and eventually this priestly class breaks off from us and goes to the people and starts to convince them like, hey, isn't what they're doing kind of wrong? Isn't what they're doing, like, isn't their strength and their dominance over you kind of an evil thing?
Yeah,
and
they're greedy.
He gives this sort of
Isn't that
example of like the hawk comes and takes the lamb, and the lambs think the hawk is evil because the hawk, and he says, no, the hawk is just being the hawk. But the slave morality is about making this whole hateful cosmology of why your enemies are bad and you are good because you're weak and you don't hurt other people and you're just meek and humble and that's his whole thing. And really all of that sort of Christian goodness is disguised vitriol for, I mean, this is him, not me. I'm sounding passionate, but that's what he said. Like the whole Judeo-Christian tradition is based on hatred and wanting to see the other people.
We're talking about like the
punishment.
blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So now the weak, instead of just being weak little like losers, now they're the blessed. Now they have their reward coming to them. And he was not.
Blessed are the
he
weak.
was extremely. I mean, he speaks against it because he thinks that this version has taken over. But he said this invention, like this Christian or Judeo-Christian invention, was the most impressive example of will to power in history, because the weak actually took over the entire world, which is exactly the opposite of what you'd expect to happen.
I mean, in the Antichrist, he says, and I think this is a remarkable quote, right? That Jesus was the only foe who was actually worthy of him. Which is pretty impressive when you think of the fact that Nietzsche did not like a lot of people, right? But he did also really argue that you want good enemies or powerful enemies, since it's only by testing yourself against them that you can become stronger. And I think his admiration for Jesus, if you want to call it that, is precisely because of what you're talking about, right? Jesus had a message. He was killed, and yet despite the fact that he was killed and everyone thought he's gone, billions of people rose up in his name, and the weak overcame the strong for a time. And he has this remarkable passage somewhere, I think it might have been in Antichrist, but I'm not sure, where he talks about pity in the kind of way that Eric was describing, right? Where he said, think about how good it feels to pity someone else, right? You can sit there and not only do you feel morally superior, but you can also sit there and think, thank God I'm not them, right? Not only am I better for them because I feel bad for them, but I'm also not them, and that demonstrates my own superiority, right? And he says, when you think about this, this goes to show you just how the life-denying instinct of Christianity was able to create all of these weird pathological propensities, right? And sometimes he almost seems to admire them. I mean, he has this amazing comment in the Genealogy of Gnarls where he says, yeah, Christianity fucked a lot of people up by giving them all these weird pathologies, but these pathologies also deepen the human soul, right? Because now we have to deal with all these neuroses about guilt and pity and do I actually genuinely feel bad for this person? And, you know, you can look at a Dostoevsky novel and there's all kinds of interesting things in there. And that's the reason why, right?
And like, we're saying that Nietzsche is against Judeo-Christianity. And I think we should qualify that because, he's got nothing but good things to say for Jesus, because Jesus was like 100% committed to his cause until death. And that's an admirable quality. What he really hates are the priests. He also speaks, his other hero is King David from the Old Testament, because what's the right word for that? Hebrew Bible? Anyway, but King David was a warrior and a poet. So he's like the most beautiful person in history because he's an artist and like a conqueror. So he's not like opposed to the whole tradition. He's really opposed to the priests and what priests do with it and how priests like manage people, and as Eric was saying, they sow this discontentment.
Yeah, and I think
ultimately,
I think what's interesting is the way the way like he talks about how like Christianity is an expression of will to power, right? So like that's kind of interesting because he condemns like the way it's directed, but he also in other places values the will to power as being like the guide to the truth. So there's like it almost seems like there's like a contradiction between, well, if Christianity is an expression of the will to power, then you should like it because it's the will to power, like expressing itself. But you're saying that that's like a worse will to power than the will to power that I guess it's like. So I don't know if anyone wanted to like pick up on that. I feel like there's an answer for that,
right? So he'll never say like this is bad. Christianity's bad. He will just say I don't like Christianity. He's an iconoclast, and he's saying like we lost this beautiful Greek world of tragedy and heroes because of these like weak people took over. But he respects that it took over, right? He's but he does make like value claims about like the. You know, the vitality of the organism of the human that like Christianity by and large is like somehow like doing, even though it is an expression of will to power, it's also somehow suppressing some aspect of the human animal that he doesn't seem to like.
Hill says this, and he doesn't say Christianity is bad in the moral sense, right? Since, of course, we're supposed to live beyond good and evil. But there are other passages where he does say, particularly in the genealogy of morals, that, look, we have to look at Christianity from a historical standpoint. And recognize not just that it's admirable in some sense because the weak overcame the strong, but again, because the contributions of Christianity at its best deepened the human psyche or the human soul, right? By forcing it to deal with problems and inclinations that weren't explicit before, right? And now we're in a crisis because sometimes he almost seems to write, and this goes to show you to the moodiness of Nietzsche, like we've fallen from an authentic Christian impulse where people really had to wrestle with these problems. Back in, the days of Christ. And now what we get is watered down Christianity, a la democracy and socialism and Kantianism, right? Where people just want, to be Christian without having to buy into all the kind of hard, difficult stuff about God that people had to deal with back in, the ancient world.
Well, he was a very great admirer of Saint Augustine, and I think he said something like Augustine was the first psychologist. I'm misremembering that, but no, he's not against Christians. He's against, thoughtful Christianity. He's against this herd Christianity.
Yeah. Well, he does have some pretty harsh things to say in the genealogy of morality. Like, he does say that Jesus was basically like a trap planned by the Jews to get everyone onto their side.
What?
He does say that in the first essay, and he also clarifies in the first essay, because the first essay is called Of Good and Bad and Good and Evil. And good and evil is what he's trying to get beyond. Good and bad is what the aristocratic nobility class had. Bad was derivative of good. But in beyond good and evil, the good and evil part is the Christian morality, because evil is derivative of good.
Right.
Because everything that's good for the aristocrats becomes evil for the Christians. And for the priestly class. And then the Jews invent Christianity in order to get everybody on their side and give this sort of, he calls it a trap, really. He just said, like, he respects it all. Like, this is that placating move, right? Like, even when we read Walter Benjamin, we're like, the death of the aura, he really respects the aura and stuff. But he never really says that. He just says, this is what's happening. It's fading away. And really, Christianity is like an extension of Judaism, and it was this symbol of the cross, this monstrous concept of a dead God, was a powerful symbol that they used, because the priestly class is one. There's no worse enemies to have than the priests. They are the biggest haters in history, and they are also craftier than the nobility. So their hatred, their nursing their wounds, will always win out over the cheerful, happy-go-lucky, gay nobility, right? Who they respect their enemies. They respect bad things. And respect is already a bridge to love. But the Christians, they hate and they disguise it as love. And that's the difference.
He has this amazing passage, though, about Jesus, right? And Christianity. It says, think of how powerful this gesture was. Because if you think about the Greek world, the gods occasionally did suffer in the Greek world, but they were immortal and kind of operating in an eternal realm beyond human suffering, right? Whereas what the Christian myth did so poignantly is precisely it kind of made God into a loser, right? If you think about the story of Jesus, Jesus is a loser, right? He's born, he preaches, he gets a few followers, then the Romans turn him in, everyone decides that they don't like Jesus anymore since the authority has said that he's failed. Then he gets crucified, and there's only a few people who bother to go to his funeral, right? And the accomplishment historically of Christianity in some senses is by recognizing that this guy, even though he is a loser, is a powerful symbol to all the weak everywhere, right? Because it says that eventually he will rise again and he will inherit the earth, and so too will you. And any number of Greek philosophers would look at that and be bewildered by this, because they'd be like, well, this isn't a powerful symbol. It doesn't have a kind of noble bearing to it. But for, the millions of disenfranchised people across the globe, obviously that's not what they're looking for, since a life of nobility is so far removed from them. And yet this figure, it looks and acts exactly like them, right?
And this thing about poisoning values, I just want to explain in case any of our listeners are not with us here. But in Christianity, you can just look at what are the sins: gluttony, avarice, pride. And these are values for the aristocracy, because pride is just, I'm stronger than everybody else and I know that. Gluttony is just you have enough food to eat and no one else does, and the priests want you to share it. Avarice is like you're greedy, but if you were the king on the hill, why should you not be greedy? You won. You're winning. So this turning of all aristocratic goodness, greed, avarice, now it becomes a sin to be those things. And yeah, that's his objection.
Yeah, also lust, it's worth noting, because...
Yeah, lust. You can't get laid? No one can get laid now.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. It's really difficult to actually pin down what he has to say on any given matter canonically. I think for exactly this reason, right? Nietzsche's not a dialectician, like I said. He seems to have this kind of idea that Hegelianism is wayfish and kind of cuckish, and everybody's trying to have everything both ways, right? But he does seem to say things like, well, on the one hand, I'm offended by this because it doesn't have a kind of noble aura to it. On the other hand, you do have to admire the fact that these people came to inherit the earth and they were able to overcome the strong, despite the fact that the strong, by definition, are stronger than the weak, right?
So Nietzscheanism is epic and the rest of it is cucked. So why don't we shift here and talk a little bit about how did he influence philosophy so strongly? And we could talk about people like Freud or Foucault. Heidegger obviously wrote his longest book on Nietzsche. How does this get applied?
Richard Spencer.
Existentialism too.
Existentialism. Yeah, we have this how did his method and specifically his historicity, saying everything is in history and history is not going anywhere, how did that play out in the 20th century?
So he's also lumped in with Marx and Freud in this hermeneutics of suspicion. These guys are the inventors of hermeneutics of suspicion, which is essentially like an academic way of saying don't take things at face value. That's one of those things, right? Like goodness as a moral virtue is something that we should be suspicious of, because we're saying, well, what is goodness good for? Who does it work for? And we have to look at it historically and do this sort of genealogical approach, right? Where did it come from? It came from the ancient world and was passed down through all the transformations we've been talking about, where originally it referred to class, and then it came to refer to something more like being good is something about being weak and being dominated. And then it came to be completely detached from its historical point, and it became something metaphysical. And he doesn't like that because metaphysics kind of spells this detachment from reality for him.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, but I don't think I could really put it better, right? This notion that morality and value systems aren't eternal and they don't exist in some kind of metaphysical heaven, the way that Plato conceived of them, but they're embedded in the life practices and the kind of natural history of mankind. It actually seem, I think, like kind of commonsensical to us now, since so many people have internalized this idea, right? But at the time, certainly in the 19th century, this is a radical notion, right? What do you mean that our values don't come from heaven, or they're not eternal, or they're not universally valued? And we're still in the midst of these kind of debates today, right?
So I would say, I think that's a good place to flag the influence that Nietzsche had on existentialism, right? Because I think existentialism kind of takes that claim and runs with it, right? That values aren't like divined from above, right? And in some ways, like we kind of have to figure them out on our own. We have to like, and of course Nietzsche had something different than what a lot of the existentialists had in mind, which is that, there's going to be some, these great philosophers of the future who are going to come and like determine these great values for everybody. But I think existentialism is sort of picked up on that idea and said, we have to figure these things out on our own and make the values that make sense for us.
Sartre, the Marxist revolution will save us.
And also like the anxiety of life and like that we're not going to have anybody hold our hand, that like life is like a difficult and a contingent and imbued with specificities that we can't subsume under some moral system. Existentialism, I think, is picking up on that and saying we have to like live in that and be okay with it.
Yeah. I think we mentioned it before, but the mantra of existentialism is existence precedes essence, right? And for Nietzsche, there is no sort of neutral subject behind the actions. When we act, when we do things, when we think things, and even he actually links this to science too. He'll say like it's energy that moves things. And he says, no, there's no distinction between the energy that moves things and the thing being moved. Just like there's no neutral agent behind the willing or the doing, right? Like to do is to be. It's the same thing for Nietzsche.
I always found that a little bit problematic, though, because that almost seems like metaphysics, though. I mean, I think this is where we get into an inescapable problem with him, right? Which is that if you say, I'm a post-metaphysical philosopher, but then you say, ultimately, all existence is energy, or all existence is will to power. It's like, wow, it's hard to think of a more grandiose metaphysical statement than that, right?
He's sneaking in metaphysics for sure.
Well, he's saying science. He's a philologist, right? Mm-hmm. So he's saying when science talks this way, they are a dupe of linguistic habits. That's what he's going to say. We are treating the grammatical subject as something metaphysical and real and behind existence. But he's saying he's a philologist, right? And all through his works, he's tracing terms back to their origin. He's bringing up what is good in French, what is good in this language, what is good in that language. And they all have this common sort of root in class consciousness, right? The good are the upper class and the bad are the common class. But they reverse that. They turn that around. So for him, like doing and the subject of the doing, if we regard the subject of the doing as something separate from the doing, then what we're doing is we're falling prey to our language habits, basically. We're reifying, we're hypostasizing, all those fancy words. But I think that's the thrust of existentialism, is that you exist and you do things before essences emerge. Before things are what they are, they just have to be for a little while, One
of my favorite quotes of all time by him is, we are not yet rid of God because we still have faith in grammar. This essence that like holds the rest of the world together that we still believe in. And then, his attention to language is actually quite surprising when you look at it and look at how many of his arguments are grounded in language, right? And this is one of the really influential things about him. You're going to see this come back in Heidegger in a big way, taking words and then looking at their Greek origins. So what is presence for Heidegger? Presence is parousia. Where does that come from? That comes from the Greek metaphysical tradition, right? Like this is a huge thing. And we get into this sort of language determines reality kind of argument, but what Nietzsche and Heidegger and some of those guys are trying to do is weird. Like it's strange. It's using etymologies and philology in order to like sort of explode the taken for grantedness of these terms we use, truth and the subject and what is good and bad. And he's using the philological argument, like in a way, almost like more than we probably should be, because like maybe words and etymologies don't make that good at the basis. They're not so good at the basis of our arguments. And this is called historicism, right? And it's turned into what's called an archaeology of knowledge by Foucault. Foucault, I think, grounds it a little bit more in practice than just language, as Nietzsche does. But for instance, Heidegger and Derrida, following Heidegger, adopt this method and use this method in order to, like, Nietzsche precursor deconstruction by doing his philology.
That's what I was going to say, actually, because one of the ways that you can interpret Derrida, particularly like the early Derrida of the 1960s and 70s, like reacting precisely against the kind of Platonic conceit that you would sometimes see in, say, positivistic approaches to language, right? Which is that basically whatever word that you talk about has some kind of real object that is pointed to in the external world, right? So you can draw one comparison between the kind of Platonic essence of a thing in language with this kind of material instantiation in the empirical world, right? And he says, no, that's not true, right? I mean, we have to get past the idea that there's some kind of transcendent sign that tells you the way that the world really is, and recognize that there's just a collection of different signs that are essentially all relating to one another, and we play with them, right? And we play with them in a variety of ways. Sometimes when I say apple, it means one thing. Sometimes when I say apple, it means, the company, right? Or my iPad or my iPhone or whatever it happens to be, right? And all of this is legitimate, and we should stop trying to suggest that all things need to be tied up neatly with a bow.
Words don't point to facts; they point to values, right? Everything's values.
Yeah. And they have a history, and they have an actual history of usage and our thought, right? Like when he says that the first metaphor is when we name something, right? And in that naming, we introduce a gap. And that gap is the subject-object gap, right? Because when we take something into our language, then it can become the subject of a sentence or the object of a sentence, right? The apple, I threw an apple, right? So I'm the subject and the apple is the object, right? We introduce that gap. That's that gap that Kant could never solve the problem of, right? Between the subject and the object. And Nietzsche's whole argument is, that's because it's a reified grammatical construct. And then the second metaphor for him is when we use these words and we forget originally where they come from, what their experiential grounding was, where we first encountered that thing that we named. It becomes second metaphor, right? Truth.
Yeah.
Then
for
just
a second, because we're talking a little bit abstractly. But by the way, we have a patron who's a linguist, and she always fact checks our etymology studies. So shout out to her. I'm gonna try to do this right. But we're talking about truth as like this origin word of metaphysics. And when you think of true, you think of truth as something abstract, something that is out there. And we talk about how we understand and get to the truth. But if you trace the etymology of the word true back to Old English and prior, it means tree. And tree becomes the word for like firmness or whatever, the adjective for firmness. So, but it means drew is the word. And we have the word druid that comes from the same word for oak tree. But yeah, so it's showing that you can have this whole apparatus and this abstraction, but if you trace the words, they don't begin in something abstract, obviously. It's not like they begin with God. They actually begin with a phenomenal interaction with the world, and then through language become something much more abstract that can be put to use in something like metaphysics.
See, that's basically the beginning of metaphysics, when we're at the second metaphor level, when it loses its origin. And that's the obsession with these origins and tracing things back, right? We put them back where they belong almost.
Yeah, and I would even talk about, just to move away from language for a second, even though it's really an interesting topic, somebody who wasn't afraid of metaphysics, somebody like Gilles Deleuze, right? I think he actually tries to give a metaphysical interpretation at some point of what Nietzsche was talking about, albeit, with Bergson and Spinoza thrown in. Because one of the things that, Deleuze says is there's always been this temptation in Western metaphysics and even in Western practice to want to eliminate difference, right? And eliminate the particularity that we find in existence by suggesting that ultimately all things are God, right? You think about like Plotinus, right? Or ultimately all things exist in this kind of Platonic heaven. And Deleuze says, no, we should sit there and appreciate difference in and of itself, right? What each thing is, or what each process is in its specificity, without trying to subsume it under some kind of higher metaphysical system.
Yo,
that's exactly
Matt,
it.
I know you haven't listened to my podcast with Chris, right? It's really funny that you're bringing this up because it was on exactly this topic. So there's a previous podcast. It's on process metaphysics, as you're saying. Gilles Deleuze, Nietzsche have a process-based metaphysics, whereas most of Western metaphysics, and why Heidegger, Derrida, Nietzsche reject Western metaphysics is because it's too based on substances, and particularly these special, invisible substances.
It's static, right? Yeah, that's like what post-structuralism does is it says it hides the difference, right? When we wake up one day, we say there's a dog. We wake up the next day, we say there's a dog. It introduces this sort of false continuity, and we lose the differences. And where post-structuralism is focused on difference. And so when you get into the metaphysics, where things have labels, things have names, you sort of forget the difference because each thing is what it is. It is what we called it yesterday, and it will be tomorrow. And his sort of linguistic argument revolves around this kind of weird and
By the way,
awesome
can you
thing.
talk about that for just a second longer? Because one of our patrons asked me in the message, how do you define the distinction between structuralism and post-structuralism? And we're almost there, so if anyone wants to take that for a second.
Yeah. Post-structuralism is really about the structure is a static structure, and it produces phenomenon, and the structure is what's behind the phenomenon, and the structure doesn't change, right? So when you have, say, a linguistic structuralism, you have a series of words connected with a series of concepts, and those concepts become part of binaries, right? Good and bad, man and woman, nature and culture, subject and object, and they don't change. But the surface effects change. But that's what we want to get away from in post-structuralism. We don't want to just say that the surface is what's changing, but the deeper structure is always the same. This is Derrida in 1966 saying, I think there's something like an event has happened in structuralism. And the event is something new. And structuralism can never account for something new because the structure isn't allowed to change. It's a series of cross-sections. And how you get from A to B is a mystery. We just know that A is one way and B is another way. And maybe that's a bad way of explaining it, but that was my understanding.
Well, structuralism is just basically how do we get from this sound that comes out of your mouth, how do you get that to the world? How does the sound of your mouth saying like tree, obviously we always use the example of tree, but how does tree mean tree to your mind, to the tree outside? What is the connection there?
That's and then it's arbitrary.
Right. So they make a structure out of this and develop a linguistic in this way. But if you want to get into that gap, this is what post-structuralism is going to look for, where the gaps exist in what we think knowledge is, for example, or what we think history is, or what we think God is. You're going to find where that gap is like a little bit covered over instead of dealt with properly.
Yeah, like another big quote from Nietzsche is every concept makes something that is not equivalent.
Right.
That's one of his big quotes, and that's sort of one of the major drivers behind post-structuralism.
I don't know that one.
That
sounds really good.
Differences everywhere. Yeah. I don't know if that's from Nietzsche or if that's just a quote I'm reading from somebody like explaining something important about post-structuralism. But yeah, every concept hides the differences, and the post-structuralists are all about the differences.
I wanted to frame it a slightly different way, though, because like just come back to like Nietzsche's historicity, right, and particularly its influence on somebody like Foucault, right. One of the ways that I interpret structuralism, looking at it very broadly rather than just as a linguistic theory pioneered by Saussure, right, is the notion that the phenomenal world that we apprehend can be understood with reference to deeper structures that can be unmasked through, say, dialectical analysis, right, via Hegel, right, or Saussurean analysis of the holism of our linguistic life worlds, right. And one of the things that the post-structuralists do, like Foucault, and following from Nietzsche, is say no, because the problem is that you're still trying to eliminate difference in the world by saying that while it appears that there's difference, this can all be explained by the structure. And one example of this that I think Nietzsche picked up on is there can be this temptation in Marxist theory to say that, yes, there are different historical epochs, different ways of organizing the economy, different ways that people have produced things, but ultimately they all will wind up in a capitalist society because there's a kind of motion of history, or there's a movement to history, and in the end, we're going to all wind up in a communist society, right? Now that's putting it in the way that post-structuralists understood Marx, right? I
mean, like a progress kind of argument.
Yeah, and I think there are people who argue that Marx is more complicated, and we can come back to that, right? But the post-structuralists really push against that by saying, no, don't sit there and say that earlier societies are just some kind of way station on the way to who we are right now. Right? You should look at these independent societies, understand the logics behind their thinking, and recognize that they're discrete and interesting in and of themselves, not just as kind of way stations on the way to understanding modernity, right?
If you think that history has a purpose, like if you believe in any kind of progress, if you think history has a purpose, then Nietzsche wants to have words with you because it's random.
I mean, the death of God thing has a lot of meanings. And one of them, you should connect this listener in this Patreon episode. So we're talking to the nobles, not the unwashed masses.
No plebs.
So you'll probably know about the Barthes Death of the Author paper, and Death of the Author is an echo in the transition to post-structuralism of the death of God. Right? It's the thing that's outside of history that guarantees history's movement towards some fantastic conclusion, whatever it is.
You're nailing it.
So the death of the God is that, that position no longer exists outside of the rules of the system, right? It's the thing that guides the system, but isn't subject to the rules of the system. It's also what we call the Archimedean point, right? Archimedes says, give me one solid point and I'll lift the whole world. Well, the death of God is also a kind of denial of that third person objectivity. There is none of that when we're talking about language and history. Everything's relative to these things. There's nothing that sits outside of it, but also determines it. And that's also Derrida's argument in a much more sort of, I'd say, sophisticated way. I don't find Nietzsche very sophisticated. Poetically, he's brilliant, but in terms of his thinking, I think Heidegger immediately runs right past it.
That's what I was going to say about Derrida, though. I mean, one of the things that he picks up on from Brecht and other people who write about the death of the author, right, is precisely that the problem with structuralism in some ways, is that there's this insistence that we can still formalize the meaning of a given term, and that's by looking at, to a certain extent, this historically determined, the historically given role of a term in a system of signs, right? And once we understand the system, we understand what that word means. And I think it's important to note that Derrida never sits there and says there shouldn't be things like canonical interpretations that help inform our disparate interpretations of a given term. He's very expressive about that.
He doesn't say there shouldn't be centers. Yeah. He doesn't say there are no centers.
That's exactly it. He's very expressive about that in his 1967 paper, right? In some senses, you need a canonical interpretation of a term in order to come up with idiosyncratic interpretations of it, right? But he also does insist that just because there might be canonical or more well-established interpretations of a word, that doesn't mean that that interpretation isn't repressing alternative interpretations or possibilities that this sign could be used for. And he says, in a very Nietzschean vein, you can look back at the history of the way this world has been used as a kind of, I'll use the Foucauldian term here because I think it's more down to earth, archive of different possible meanings it might have had that we could theoretically resurrect, or we could reappropriate, or we could play with, depending on if we're interested in doing that. And he gives a whole host of examples that are very interesting, right?
I want to just stress, because I think we're talking, because we're getting really excited about this. This is the most important point, the part where old philosophy is finished. Hegel's the last classical philosopher, and this is where all of the critical theory stuff comes in. So I just want to say again how important this is, because we were talking about Hegel, and Hegel's got a history, and this history has a purpose. The history is to realize freedom. But to have history have a purpose, that requires this position, what Eric called the Archimedean point. You need to have a position outside of history that's able to judge it, to be moral about history. And this is a criticism of Marxism too. And the same thing with a book. If you're going to say this book has authorial intention, you have to assume there's a position outside the book that is giving it that purpose. But as soon as you get rid of God, history's over, because history never started. You're outside of history. And then it's only these little minor stories that matter anymore. There's no grand narrative. We can call postmodernism the end of grand narratives. And that's precisely because God is dead. You can't look at history from outside of it because you're always in it. And there's no God to like give you his like super all-seeing eye from eternity so that you're not stuck in this problem. So all of 20th century philosophy is just this problem over and over again in sociology, psychology, linguistics. And people like the people that we shit on all the time, logical positivists or Jordan Peterson, they don't want to think this way. They don't want to think that this actually happened. It did happen. Nietzsche said it did, and it's over. You can't posit these grand narratives anymore. Or just assume that
Jordan Peterson loves Nietzsche, though.
Yeah, I was going to say Victor's right. I mean, Jordan Peterson absolutely adores Nietzsche. In fact, one of the weirdest things about him is he's one of those people who says, well, you know, we can have our Nietzsche and our grandiose people, but we can also have our Christian values too, right?
We can have Nietzsche, but trans people don't real.
Individualism, right? He's falling into this individualist interpretation of Nietzsche.
Yeah.
That Nietzsche is an ardent individualist, a heroic individualist.
He likes Nietzsche because Nietzsche emphasizes the suffering of life.
Like the shit that guy says about language, man. He's like, you can't just invent words. Like, fuck, man, you read Nietzsche, you idiot.
Wow, that's harsh. But yeah, no, I was going to say, I think we're all getting excited about this because of the kind of historical significance of this moment that I think we're all acknowledging in a different way, right? And I think just to kind of bring it back down to earth, because we kind of went a little bit afield into some very different fields, this just really testifies to the fact that Nietzsche, as much as Marx, and as probably more than Freud by this point, right, has had just a profound impact on so many different fields, right? He's one of those figures where if you were to ask, explain to me what his significance would be, it would be almost impossible, just because so many different people have picked up on these threads, right?
He invented sociology, basically. Like Weber directly drew from Nietzsche from this historicist argument. He invented psychology because Freud develops the unconscious from this will to power of like urges. He invented
suppressed urges. Yeah.
He invented linguistic analysis, at least in the continental version, because Heidegger goes back to all these terms and I think Heidegger was a worse philologist than Nietzsche, but he just kicked off. It's hard to understate the gravity of this event.
It's pretty impressive for an incel.
Yeah, I think Foucault, just like to really simplify Foucault's kind of, he takes on so Nietzsche does good and evil. Foucault does in the history of sexuality, he does male and female. In the history of in his prison book, right? Discipline and Punish, he does civilian and criminal. And
madness and healthy, right?
Yeah, sane and insane, right? Like he takes that sort of idea that these binaries have like a history, and he just applies them to different things, right? The hospital, the prison, and like discourses of the body and sexuality.
Matt, did you say not bad for an incel?
I did.
Because that's an underrated joke.
Yeah. No. But like I was going to say, I mean, this is what I find really helpful about Foucault, right? And I don't always have nice things to say about him, but right, like he really does take this project forward and run with it. And I think it was in 1980, somebody asked him, and he's like, I am a Nietzschean, right? And you can really see that, right? Where he shows a lot of fidelity to this project. But this is actually where I think we should maybe shift towards a more political dimension, just because I know that we have Biner who's coming on in 2 weeks. Biner, sorry. Why do I always say that? Biner's coming on in 2 weeks to talk about Nietzsche and politics. And one of the interesting things about Nietzsche is precisely that you see people on very different ends of the political spectrum finding him appealing, right? People like Michel Foucault find him appealing. There are any number of Marxists like Terry Eagleton who find him appealing. But so do an awful lot of fascists, right?
That Spencer guy.
Yeah, Richard
Dugan.
Spencer, the Nazi Party loved him, even though he would certainly not be a Nazi.
Yeah.
By the way, listener, what Matt's referencing is the reason we're doing Nietzsche and Heidegger first is because we are interviewing an expert in those areas, but we wanted to establish, I guess, our take on it. Is that what we're doing?
I guess so. It's kind of a preparatory episode, I guess, but only for the patrons. So, and it's Professor Ronald Biener at University of Toronto.
Thank you, Victor. I fucked up.
So,
But
yeah, why? How could you appropriate this for a right wing perspectives? I mean, it's not impossible. It's a lot more easy to appropriate Nietzsche for right wing purposes than someone like, I don't know, Rancière.
Yeah.
Or Marx.
I mean, I did read I went back to the Genealogy of Morals, and I was like, well, this is right-wing shit. And then I read it, and I was like, he says some pretty fucked up things in this. Like, he talks about Jews and dark-haired people quite a bit, and he has some, like, things to say about that would not be acceptable.
Well, I mean, okay, here's
World War II.
I think I willfully ignored that part because I don't remember it. I always assume when he's talking about Jews, it's like the Judaism kind of paradigm, world paradigm.
Like, I do the same thing I do when I'm like, oh, Heidegger wasn't all that. Like, because he's kind of saying like Jewish and Christian are the same sort of thing.
I don't think that part's really the problematic part. If you call like being like right wing problematic, like I think the problematic part is that Nietzsche is blatantly an anti-egalitarian, and like the fact that his whole value system is about like. So I would say like if I was to sum up like Nietzsche's political vision in like if I was to simplify it, I would say to some extent he's like the cultural values of society have to be those that uncover are the vitalistic like instincts for life in like so that the best souls can be raised to the top. And if that's at the cost of the weak, so be it. The weak should suffer because the strong should be the ones because the greatness of humanity can only be properly instantiated if the instincts of the culture is life affirming in such a way that those souls who have the best ability to self-overcome in accordance with the will to power,
does he make that raised up so that the
Victor? Weak. He did. So he says it in a few places. He talks about how like the spirit of a people have to be such that they push the values that can create life affirming horizons, and life affirming horizons are those kinds of things that can like allow that like deny the weak and like we don't care about the weak and we care about the ones who are going to be the noble souls of the future.
At the same time, though, he was also an ardent anti-nationalist. He said like being proud of your country is like the stupidest thing you can do.
Yeah, like I think the anti-egalitarian thing is debatable.
So I don't think there's any debate about that. I mean,
no, there's no debate about that.
I think it's extremely debatable.
Okay.
So here's what.
Wait.
So
Let Eric make the case.
Like where does he say that he is for hierarchies, that he is for inequality, that he thinks inequality is good? Like what he seems to be saying is that the morality that the weak creates a worse kind of enmity in society than if we just sort of let the aristocratic values be the dominant kind of thing. Because he's going to say, like, okay, I'll say his horrible shit. He's going to say that like Jews are the worst enemies to have because they hold a grudge and they're smart about it. Whereas he's going to say it's a sign of the strong that they cannot for long take serious their enemies. They're going to forgive, respect your enemies because respect is a bridge to love. Whereas with enemies of the, say, Judeo-Christian tradition, those enemies are evil and evil people are damned to hell. And there's like, he's almost saying that they are more inegalitarian than if we could just take on a more, like, if you just wake up. Remember at the beginning we were saying like his philosophy is shocking. Like he wants to shock you out of your sort of complacency and get you thinking. And it's to say these values you're holding are creating terrible problems in our society. And if you just look at them and realize that that's what they're doing, you can actually wake up and be life affirming and say, fuck your enemies. They're my enemies today, but tomorrow they'll be my friends because I fucking respect them. Right? Like he's not like the anti-egalitarian thing in Nietzsche. Okay, it seems that way if you take things out of context and put certain things together, but I don't think that's the upshot.
I don't think it's out of context.
He wants
at all.
an inegalitarian
all right,
society.
Matt, give us
show me where he says that.
I want to add something to this rebuttal too.
Okay.
Okay, so let me just read this quote here. This was
Oh God, he's cheating. You're cheating. You can't use quotes.
No, come on.
No, but I mean, this is really telling, right? Where he says, the great majority of men have no right to life and serve only to disconcert the elect among our race. I do not grant the unfit that right. There are even unfit peoples, right? And there are volumes of quotes to this effect, right? Where he says things like, the 20th century will be marked by wars with horror yet unseen upon the earth. And I look forward to it because this will at least like extirpate the kind of morality of the slave by demonstrating how banal and evil communism is, amongst other things, right?
So and let me just add one more thing to that too. I want to add one more thing to that, which is just that. So I like to give some sort of an olive branch, maybe to the worry of like what Eric is getting at is like. So I also think that Nietzsche would condemn any like any existing fascist movement that has happened in human history. Like I think he would look at, I don't know, Nazism and any of these things and be like, you guys became followers and peasants and like you weren't really,
yeah, I agree with that.
You weren't really being a people and a culture that was life affirming. Like you were being some other shit. Like he would be very critical. So I'm not saying he's like a Nazi in that or like an anti-egalitarian in a way that resembles any like existing political ideology. It just means that ultimately he doesn't care about equality or like making sure that we can have the best society for the most number of people. Quite the opposite, in fact. I would say that he wants the best to rise up and fuck everybody else who's not contributing to like good life affirming values.
And one thing that I want to add to that, because it builds right off, is he doesn't think that inequality needs to be like fixed, because he actually thinks that inequality is better for the people who are oppressed, because when you're oppressed, you create better art. Basically, you invent dance, you invent literatures. Deleuze picks up on this. You can laugh more, you sing more, and this is back to the master-slave dialectic. The people who are oppressed create better stuff, right? And he's especially he loves art, all kinds of art, dance, music, etc. And he says if you're the inegalitarian system is better for everybody because the poor make better art and the rich get to have this mutual.
And the best souls can rise up.
Yeah.
But either way, you're going to have inequality. You're not going to be egalitarian in the sense of like not everyone's going to be equal. But what you guys, I'll just play devil's advocate a little bit and say what you guys are saying is that he is anti-woke and therefore he is inegalitarian. Well, yes, he is anti-woke. He thinks that the slave morality is silly.
I don't think it's anti-woke to say that it's a bad thing when you claim the mass of people, the great majority of humankind, has no right to life. I mean, that's not anti-woke, right?
That's anti-liberal, that's anti-communist.
Well, he doesn't believe in any rights. He thinks rights are just a tool to constrain strength.
And that's what instinct. I mean.
I'm just saying he would be against any left-wing project for social transformation. He would be against.
Yeah.
But then he would also be against any right-wing project of, I don't think he would be a supporter of Donald Trump either.
That's what I was saying before.
He would be against the alt-right. He would be against the, woke left. He would almost be a centrist in that sense. Well, but he would also be very radical in a different way.
Political system that's
he would be against. But very much what he wants though. But we can't lose sight of what he does say that he wants, which is for life affirming values that privilege the best souls, the soul, and that is an idea that is contrary to any left wing perspective. Ultimately.
And I should also add, it's consistent with his genealogy also, right? Because he says that the notion of moral equality and the universal equality of all human beings came into the world with Christianity, right? The triumph of the weak over the strong. And he sometimes is very explicit about what he wants is a return to pre-Platonic thinking and this notion that some people are better. They're proud Achilles who sit there and they tyrannize, the weak who are their prey. They're the hawks, as you put it, so artfully.
I think it's and
I don't think there's any way you can give this a kind of egalitarian spin.
I don't think you can. I agree, but the point of Achilles and respect is that he doesn't even know he's oppressing. He doesn't even have enough attention to pay to poor people because he's too busy being great and conquering people and fighting
absolutely.
He fight
Absolutely.
Hector.
Exactly.
He's too busy killing Hector to care that someone has to carry his armor for him, right?
Like, he has this whole argument about, like, look at how these aristocrats have such a nuanced language when it comes to the pitiful, when it comes to the downtrodden, when it comes to people like Achilles or like the people you see in Homer, right? They have this very rich language of pity in a way, and they see people's struggles as, I don't know, he has this weird philological linguistic argument that says, well, look how rich their language for the pitiful is, and look how simple the languages of the Judeo-Christian herd moralists
Can you give an example?
are. There, I was looking for the quote. I can't find it right now. If I find it, I will
Man, we are
definitely
all
say
cheating
it.
so hard today.
I know. I've been cheating.
Actually,
I've been cheating really hard.
I have a great quote, which is just him describing. I mean, it doesn't exactly speak to this, but it's just him describing the highest kind of person in the gay science. So he says, a person whose horizon encompasses thousands of years past and future, being the heir of all nobility, of all past spirit, an heir with a sense of obligation, the most aristocratic of old nobles, and at the same time the first of a new nobility, the likes of which no age has yet seen or dreamed of. If one can burden one's soul with all of this, the oldest, the newest, losses, hopes, conquests, and the victories of humanity, if one could finally contain all this in one soul and crowd it into a single feeling, this would surely have the results in a happiness that humanity has not known so far.
That's pretty impressive. But I mean, that does definitely make the point that what he's looking for is like an aristocratic caste or a cabal, whatever you want to characterize it as. But it's definitely not a nationalistic vision. I completely agree.
It certainly doesn't resemble any right wing movements that exist today. Like he's against like peasant like idiots. So like I think he'd be my only claim would just be like to try to co-opt him as like on the left is just wrong. Like because like insofar as the left entails some form of egalitarianism.
If you compare this to Hegel, because both of them speak favorably of someone like Napoleon, right? But Hegel's reasons for extolling Napoleon is he's bringing reason, he's bringing law, he's bringing uniformity, he's creating a state. Whereas Nietzsche's reasons for loving Napoleon are like Napoleon wakes up and because he's so powerful, he has this drive in him, he just got to go conquer shit. He's doing this as like an artistic process. His art is battle and conquest. Whereas
he's
Napoleon
just a fucking badass.
Yeah.
That's why.
He was a throwback to the old Roman and Greek aristocracy.
And then you put him on prison, and then he gets out of prison, and he does it one more time. He can't be held back.
So we haven't really touched on this term yet, but resentment, ressentiment, right, in Nietzsche, right? And what he's saying is that if we lived in a society where noble values were dominant, there wouldn't be groups of people resenting one another. He says that the nobleman feels resentment, but it's absorbed in his instant reaction to it, and it doesn't poison him, as in he doesn't nurse this grudge against some other group of people. But the slave morality, the so-called egalitarians, they look at people who are inegalitarian and they say these people are evil, these people are wrong, and these people need to die. And they nurse this grudge. They don't have this immediate release because they go to their secret places and their secret gardens that are just their own worlds. And they nurse these sorts of feelings, or they try to get away from them. And then they come back to the real world and they come back to these feelings because they have no respect for the people they don't like. Like you were talking about compassion. Compassion would be having respect for the person that you're arguing against. Like, what is a woke person screaming racist, screaming misogynist, screaming you're oppressing me? Like, where's the respect in that way of arguing with somebody? Okay. Where's the compassion? It's gone because it's absorbed in the poison of the slave morality, which just erases all respect for your enemies.
Wendy Brown has a really good critique of this in her book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, right? Where she's talking about the kind of alt-right interpretation of Nietzsche. And she's very fond of Nietzsche, I should say, like I am, and like I think all of us are, in a certain sense, right? But one of the things that she points out is that if you look at the kind of examples Nietzsche gives, it's almost always of resentment, right? He's almost always talking of the resentment of the weak against the strong, and he never actually talks of the kind of resentment that the strong can feel towards the weak. except to downplay it in the way you just described. And one of the things she says is, if you look at politics in the contemporary era, people like Donald Trump, how can you describe that except as the resentment of the strong towards the weak, right? The idea that this is my society, people like me built it, I have all kinds of money and power associated with me, and how dare all of you think that you are entitled to any of that, right? And I think this is a really pretty compelling argument. And one of the things she castigates Nietzsche for is not taking into account the idea that sometimes the nobility, especially when they're looking at the downtrodden and when the downtrodden are trying to stand up to them, it can be very easy for them to feel resentment also and say, well, no, I earned this. All of you are just a bunch of layabouts who are only the beneficiaries of the values and the wealth and what the civilization I created. And you should all just shut up and go back to your place, right? And I think that's something he doesn't really talk about that much.
I think that's right. And I'm getting passionate and trying to take Nietzsche seriously. But I think you're right that, yeah, obviously Nietzsche isn't taking seriously how much it sucks to be the downtrodden and how like psychologically fucking that would be, to the point where like, how can you really respect the people who are keeping you in this position? But let me just cheat again. And I'll say, like, here's the two versions. Here's the aristocratic bad, and here is the evil of the slave morality. He says the bad of the aristocrats is just a byproduct, a complementary color, almost an afterthought, whereas the evil of the slaves is the beginning, the original creative act of slave ethics. He says saying no is the original creative act of the slave. It's saying no to another. Whereas it's almost like he's saying the yes and thing about the nobles. The nobles are always like yes and. Like, yes, good, but I disagree with you. Like he's almost giving it like that's the original act. Like that's like this is almost, I take this almost as a fiction, and I think it's complete bullshit. It's almost metaphysical in itself, but just taking it seriously for a second and saying that the evil of slave morality, the one that we're dealing with today in our society, which is so degenerate and horrible, is that it's against other people. It's a primary, originary thing. Whereas the bad of someone who's got an aristocratic mind and a great temperament, the bad there is just sort of an afterthought. It's like, oh shit, I failed to be good. So I guess that was bad, and I guess I'll try again later. I don't know.
But Brown has a really poignant example in her book that I found very resonant because I was living in Mexico at the time when I read this. And she said, if you don't believe that the powerful can have resentment towards the poor, just be a relatively privileged person, not even a very powerful person. Go walk in the street in a poor area of the city and look at a beggar. And when the beggar asks you for money, ask yourself, what feeling is it that I have? Right? Because probably the instinctual thing that you'll have when the beggar asks you for money is revulsion, followed by, why do I have to be bothered during my day? I didn't do anything that means this person is poor. I worked hard for my money, and all these kinds of feelings, right? And she says this is the kind of resentment that we feel towards the weak if we're in a privileged position all the time, because we don't like being reminded of the frailty of human existence, and we don't like being reminded of the fact that there but for the grace of God would I go. And so we hate the people that expose us to this reality quite consistently. And one of the things that she says about Nietzsche is Nietzsche had a lot of very insightful things to say about the problems with how it is that the wounded or the victimized can feel resentment and create bad and malicious systems on that basis. And she wrote a whole book on that called When Wounded Attachments. But he seems to have very little sympathy for, as you pointed out, the downtrodden, right? And the resentment that they might and the resentment that they might be the victims of continuously from the people who've appointed themselves their betters, right?
Yeah, it's hard to separate the sort of idea that like slave morality is a whole metaphysical system of ethics versus like just being in that moment and feeling pity for somebody, or even like being in that moment and you're the privileged one and just being sort of generally annoyed that they exist. I mean, it's hard to separate. You're right. It is like Nietzsche's giving us a kind of convincing fiction here that there's a lot of holes in. And yeah, like so maybe nobility is doomed and slave morality is just going to be the new norm. So then where does compassion fit in there? And Nietzsche's pretty pessimistic about there being like a true sense of morality in a society that we're in today, because we're splintered into these groups and we think everyone else is evil. And you can see it online. When someone disagrees with you, they become the enemy immediately, and not the enemy that you have respect for, that you want to fight, that you want to be your enemy, but the enemy that needs to be destroyed, the enemy that is the evil one, in all caps.
No, yeah, I think that's 100% true, right? And I've never thought about applying that kind of Nietzschean analysis to online discourse. So
we're recording for over an hour and a half now, by the way.
I have a winding thought, and I think it ends up there, but I think I'm just going to start talking and see if it gets me there. So the objection that the aristocratic values are not reflective. Like they don't have compassion. They don't put themselves in someone else's mind and go, "Oh, you're suffering," because they're too busy doing their own thing. So they don't resent the poor because they're reminded of like human frailty. They just don't like the poor because the poor are dirty. It's like completely aesthetic and affective to them, the reason that they don't like seeing weakness and grossness. It's just like, you're gross. I'm not even going to think about what you're thinking. So I think they
don't think about them at all. Yeah.
In that sense, like Trump has nothing like aristocratic values because he's a resentful bitch. And like, he's just demanding affirmation all the time. Whereas the aristocratic value person never needs affirmation from anybody because they know their strength and they know their worth. So without bringing this into like a class thing, just the way that you argue with people, I think you probably can point to people in your lives, or all of us could. There's those kind of like water off the back people that don't need to store up resentment, and they don't need to destroy because they're too busy creating and too busy being life affirming, as Nietzsche says, rather than life denying. And then there's also that cast of people, whether or not it has to do with class or not, that want to punish others and want them to feel that pain and punishment, and they're going to keep going at whatever they're going at until someone else feels that way.
There might be some truth to that, but I think you're right that that's how I read Nietzsche too. Like I remember that whole analogy with the hawk eating the mouse or whatever. It's like, it's not that the hawk feels no resentment. It's just like, I'm just doing me. I'm being me.
And
it's like, I'm not thinking about you at all.
It doesn't have any feelings.
It doesn't hate the mouse.
It's just
like, I'm just being a fucking badass that I am, and like not thinking about anything else. Right. And I think that's true. But like, this is kind of where, like, when I think about like the highest values, you know, where I feel like Nietzsche's maybe like incel-ism comes in, because it's just like, he's thinking about these artistic, creative souls who are up there not thinking about anybody else. And like, this is just my own personal like reaction, right? Whereas like, when I think of like the best people, I think of someone who's like magnanimous, who like is doing cool stuff, but is also like in touch and connects with other human beings. I think that's like an aspect that somehow like Nietzsche, because he's such an incel, like forgets about like the value of being like a magnanimous.
The paradox here is that everything Nietzsche talks about, he does the opposite. He spends all of his books whining about Christianity, whining about democracy, whining about communism, whining about the weak. Like whatever he's pointing to is not him, because an aristocratic value person would not sit there writing those books. They would just go do the stuff that they're talking about.
Exactly.
Here, I have a fun quote. All right, you go first, Matt. Then I've got.
Sure. No, well, I was going to say this is actually a kind of interesting point where I jump in with like these kind of weird Christian interpretations of Nietzsche, right? Because there have been actually intelligent Christian authors who've tried to respond to him by pointing out the kind of distinctive characteristics of Jesus, right? And they said that in the gay science, you know, Nietzsche talks about this person who can kind of combine all history in his being, probably almost invariably he, right? And will noble values. And one of the things that are pointed out by people like Nikos Kazantzakis in The Last Temptation of Christ is, well, think about Jesus, right? Here's somebody who took all human suffering on his shoulders, understood it, empathized with it, and nonetheless was able to carry on in a very heroic way, in spite of bearing everyone's suffering.
So Jesus is alpha. Jesus isn't a cuck.
Yeah, well, this is the kind of argument they make. Like, doesn't this have a kind of heroism and a kind of glory to it that's undervalued by somebody like Nietzsche? And doesn't it also link Jesus in some way holistically with the rest of the world, in a sense that Nietzsche would be disconnected, or the Nietzschean Superman would be disconnected, since he doesn't have any kind of sense for what's going on in the mind of the sheep, right? He's only concerned with doing him and being a badass. Right? And I think there's a lot to that argument, even if we secularize it. Right?
Well, here, like, there's a problem with saying that, like, Nietzsche, like, here's a quote. I'll say, what was Jesus but temptation in its most sinister form and irresistible form, bringing men by a roundabout way to precisely those Jewish values and renovations of the ideal. That's what he says about Jesus, too. So he clearly doesn't have an unambiguously positive view of Jesus.
No,
Again,
yeah.
it goes back, he thinks he's a trap. But I also have a fun quote. Okay, so you have slave morality and aristocratic morality. Let's change that to wokeness, slave morality, and privilege. Aristocratic. So what happens? Okay, so here's Nietzsche. Let's articulate this new claim. We need a critique of all wokeness. The intrinsic worth of wokeness must first of all be called into question. To this end, we know the conditions from which those values have sprung and how they developed and have changed. Hitherto, such knowledge has been a decision point. The intrinsic worth of wokeness was taken for granted as a fact of experience and put beyond question. Nobody up to now has doubted that wokeness represents a higher value and that privilege, in terms of promoting and benefiting mankind generally, even taking the long view, is evil.
That's so
But
good.
suppose that the exact opposite were true. What if wokeness represents not merely a retrogression, but even a danger, a temptation, a narcotic, a drug, enabling the present to live at the expense of the future? More comfortable, less hazardous perhaps, but also baser, more petty, so that wokeness itself would be responsible for man as a species failing to reach the peak of magnificence for which he is capable. Isn't that a cool way to read Nietzsche? If you just read him in terms of, like,
Yeah, no, that was
wokeness
pretty
and
bitchin'.
privilege.
That was amazing. Could you actually do me a favor
That
and
was amazing.
like transcribe that quote and like give me a page reference? And I don't know if you don't mind, like just because I'd love to just have that. I want to share that if you. Or take a picture
That was
of it.
pretty killer.
Take a
I
picture
read
of the,
section 6 of the preface to Genealogy of Morals.
Could you just take a photo of it and or something?
Nice.
I don't know. Anyway,
so
sorry.
there is this critique, right? The critique is fair, and how much does it apply? I don't think we have really time to get into that, but like,
No, we're way over time here. I think kind of.
well, it's good for a long one. Nietzsche's got to be long. But the
I
limits.
figured this was going to drag on.
This is just so Twitter, right? That it's punish and publicly bring down. And that's not all wokeness is. Obviously, there's like good intentions as well in critiquing privilege and things that are valuable. But like the public flogging kind of thing, cancel culture kind of thing. We have an episode on that. This I think. It just Nietzsche's system, if we're gonna just clean it out, is saying like, don't be so concerned with everybody else. Get concerned with yourself.
Yeah.
Rise above like fraying.
Clean your
Rise
room.
above punishing. Oh god, am I sound like Peterson? Fuck.
Clean your goddamn room.
No, but I mean it's a good just piece of like life advice, right? Get out of trying to
Clean your room before you go out and critique the world.
I guess that's what he's just saying. That's got to be it.
Yeah, this is like you can go through Marx's text and replace oh fuck, I forget. You can go through his text and replace proletariat with Western European values, and and it reads differently. You
That's
can do
funny.
the same with
That's
Nietzsche.
really funny.
Replace all the words where he says like good, but where he's talking about what's good from the perspective of the slave. Replace that with woke and replace bad with privilege. And it's a completely different text and it makes like weird sense to me.
Well, you could apply this slave morality to something like white nationalism also, which is just as infantile and resentful of people
like,
that people seem to be getting something that you're not getting, right?
Yeah, that's the hard part. They would need another thing. It wouldn't be like wokeness and privilege. For them, it would be like, it would be like egalitarian. They'd be like, fuck these egalitarians. You think goodness is egalitarian?
Or diversity. It would be,
I don't know.
It would be like white nationalism and diversity. Diversity would
be... cultural diversity would be their bad.
Yeah. Diversity is our
And-
strength.
Good would be nationalist
Yeah.
for them. But it might work the same way, and it's interesting to read
It's very,
in that way.
very interesting. Yeah.
Anyway, guys, shall we wrap this up, or final thoughts?
Sure. Well,
Oh
no,
my God, yeah.
I just want to say, I think that Nietzsche sometimes to characterize himself as an untimely person, right? That his time had yet to come. And I think our conversation here, if nothing else, has shown that well over 100 years after his death, his time very well may have come, since all of us have very different takes on what's valuable in his work. But we all seem to think that he's a super interesting guy, because we're now 145 minutes into this. An hour and 45 minutes into this, and there's no stopping. Yeah.
There's still a lot to say, for sure.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just say that I want to reiterate, I think maybe now by the end of the episode, patrons, you can see why 20-year-olds would be so attracted to this.
And us.
figure of this figure. I know, even though just as we finished saying how much we respect him, but yeah, obviously you can see all the aspects of him that make him so attractive. I mean, it's in some ways, I feel like Nietzsche is very punk rock. It's like a punk rock philosopher, fucking badasses and
also very
not sticking to any
it's very
that.
masculine too, right? He
very
extols
masculine.
what about a mother is like will to power?
Or he calls truth, because you can't fucking understand it, he calls truth a woman that needs to be dominated.
It is kind of the shock rock. Well, truth. Well, that's a Machiavelli quote, actually.
Oh, was it a Machiavelli?
Fortune is a woman.
Fortune is a woman, right.
Fortuna is a woman, and she needs to be beaten.
No, here he said. No, he says.
By the prince.
Actually, no, you're right. You're right. My mistake. Nietzsche says that truth is a woman, and every philosopher who thinks he's been able to get her is an idiot, and she's gonna escape his grasp every time he tries.
There's a little bit of projection there.
Yeah,
this
for
podcast
sure.
is very much in keeping with a Nietzschean aesthetics, because I just want to point out that it's had gigantic highs and huge lows. About a 1 hour in, we were basically talking about Nietzsche as if he was the greatest guy ever, being and he pioneered this and he pioneered that, and this wouldn't have existed without him. And then 20 minutes later, we were he's a fucking Nazi, and you know what I mean? His inegalitarian orientation is just and it really testifies to the fact that whatever else you want to say, he was a complicated guy, and he wanted to get a rise out of people like a punk rock worker would, and he did, right?
Yeah. I think looking forward to where we maybe evaluate whether or not Nietzsche is a so-called dangerous mind or dangerous author. I mean, I think after reading Genealogy of Morals again, I think I agree you shouldn't read him without some kind of guidance about I don't know.
From your priest?
You shouldn't don't believe, I don't know, guidance from a religious leader, or maybe just a philosopher. You shouldn't believe him too much at first until you get more of a picture of the whole. I mean, I can see how the things he says are very inflammatory and can be construed in very horrible ways. But I mean, ultimately, I don't think there's an easy thing. What did Nietzsche think? I don't know. It's not an easy question to answer, but I think there are some dangers to the ways that Nietzsche and just the appeal his sort of poetic style has. Everybody wants to read someone who says truths, but also in the most beautiful way possible.
In the most badass way.
Yeah, Nietzsche does that very well.
It's kind of if you say I'm being Nietzschean because I'm being so epic, then just by saying that, you're not being Nietzschean. Because the actual overman would never even know that he's an overman. Everyone else would know it.
It's kind of it's that paradox with hipsterdom. It's as soon as you admit you're a hipster, you're not a hipster.
That's true.
Yeah.
All right, listeners. Yeah. Well, thanks for taking this ride with us. I would be impressed if you finished the whole thing. And
we'll see how you edit it down.
Well, I think it was pretty coherent on its own.
It was quite coherent. I think so too.
But anyway, thank you for being patrons. We hope you appreciate this extension of our will to power, and I hope you don't resent us for anything we may have said.
Well, as Eric already said, you guys are the aristocracy in our
You're our nobles, anyway. Yeah. Love you, you bunch of eagles. You.
I think.
Yeah.
That was good.
I've had a couple beers, so I'm going to go indulge my will to piss. So I'll be back.
Okay,
Or should we sign off now?
All
Let's
right,
just sign
guys.
off.
See ya. Thanks for coming. Peace.
See ya. Thank
Peace.
you.